Chapter 6. The Lay of the Land in Gaza. Dr. Bill. Background of the crisis in Gaza. Mr. Haniyeh came to power in a democratic process in January 2006, after Hamas earned a plurality of representatives elected to the Palestine Legislative Council. The PLC is the Palestinian Authority's parliament. This mandate resulted directly from democratic elections that were carefully observed by international monitors, including Jimmy Carter and his organization. These January 2006 elections were deemed fair, in spite of the Israeli occupation authorities, who interfered with Palestinian political campaigns, especially in East Jerusalem. Weeks after the election, Israel summarily imprisoned elected West Bank PLC members who are also members of Hamas. The Israelis have since put a suffocating chokehold on the entire Gaza Strip. In spite of their rhetoric about wanting to promote democracy in the Middle East, the US, Israel, the UK, and the EU did not respect the democratic mandate among the Palestinians. Instead, under Israel's insistence, the West has done everything it can to undermine the democratic process. When a Palestinian National Unity Government for the Palestinian Authority was carefully negotiated with the help of the Saudis in early 2007, Israel and the Bush administration worked tirelessly to undermine it. In Gaza, covert actions against Hamas occurred relentlessly through the offices of Elliot Abrams, the National Security Agency, and the CIA. Abrams has supported renegade militias, like those controlled by Fatah strongman Mahmoud Dallon. These militias were encouraged by the Americans and the Israelis to incite a Palestinian civil war in Gaza to take out Hamas. In June 2007, internecine warfare started, and Hamas prevailed in Gaza, while Fatah prevailed in the West Bank. Israel and the neocons in America succeeded again in a ruthless, cunning, and cruel division and conquest of Palestine. This cruel siege of the Gaza Strip, which has been going on to some extent for years, became intensified, especially after September 2007, when Israel declared Gaza a hostile entity. Collective punishment of the entire population of Gaza for having the nerve to voice their democratic choice has been put in place in a misguided attempt to limit the power and influence of Hamas. Efforts by Israel and America to undermine the democratic process in Palestine leaves a bitter taste for so-called democracy and other Western values in the mouths of most Gazans. There is now widespread alienation away from these values, allowing those with more fundamental and authoritarian methods of governance to take hold. I notice these changes compared to when I last visited Gaza in 2006. This is largely what is behind the move toward Hamas. It was a protest vote against the lack of tangible progress in Palestinian human rights and a perceived corruption and incompetence in the existing Palestinian Authority, PA, and political party, Fatah. Of course, it has been American and Israeli officials who did most of the corrupting of the PA and Fatah. Israel has been unwilling to negotiate with Hamas, just as they were unwilling to negotiate with the more secular PLO 20 years ago. They keep playing this game of finding endless reasons why they can't negotiate, because the Israeli government prefers full-spectrum dominance over negotiation and fairness. We all know the current precondition that we hear all the time in our media for Israel's negotiating with Hamas, that they need to renounce violence and recognize Israel's right to exist. Sounds reasonable. Let's look at this little further. How about another precondition that we never hear in our media, that is equally valid, like not one more dime for Israel until they renounce violence and recognize Palestine's right to exist? This seems reasonable too. There are roughly 6 million Jews and 6 million Christian, Druze, and Muslim Palestinian Arabs living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, not to mention an additional 6 million Palestinians living in exile. Israel and the US are always looking for excuses not to negotiate with Palestinian leaders and other powers that be in the region that try and stand up for their rights and against neocolonialism. The Israelis and Americans like to bully the situation and try to create quislings within the Palestinian leadership that they can negotiate with in bad faith. Superficial frames around Israel's right to exist seem reasonable to the majority of Israelis and Americans. We are encouraged to indifference and apathy by our mainstream media. They don't really want us to know the full dimension of suffering among the Palestinians, in particular the current deliberate man-made catastrophe in Gaza or our deep financial role in all of it. Israel and the US took the same approach with the PLO until 20 years ago. In those days the Israeli occupation authorities encouraged the growing Hamas movement in Gaza, while shunning the PLO. This was also divide and rule in the opposite direction than it is run now. Finally Arafat was forced to recognize Israel and renounce the Palestinians' right to exist on 78% of their historic homeland. He did this in 1988 and again in 1993. Arafat was a civil engineer, not a lawyer. He assumed his concession would mean that 22% of historic Palestine, including East Jerusalem, would become the Palestinian homeland. He did not fully understand how the game was being played. What did Arafat get for the Palestinian people in exchange for Israeli recognition? He got virtually nothing. Only further loss of his credibility among Palestinians. His loss of credibility resulted from subsequent worsening of internal corruption and favoritism within his organization, which was encouraged by the Israelis and the Americans. The weak and subservient PA followed, including the disaster that resulted from the endless so-called Oslo peace process, whereby the remnant of Palestine continued to be divided by checkpoints and Israeli settler highways into smaller pieces. Arafat wound up under house arrest the last 2.5 years of his life. Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, the current prime minister in the West Bank, has gotten very little for all his reconciliatory remarks. Now the Palestinian population is either exiled or warehoused between walls. The overall situation for Palestinians is now much worse than when the PLO recognized Israel 20 years ago. The point is that people have a right to exist. Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs each have a right to exist. But nation-states don't necessarily have a right to exist, especially if the foundation of their existence is based on underlying injustice. Apartheid in South Africa did not have an inherent right to exist, nor did the Confederate States of America. Imagine if talks between Nixon and Brezhnev back in the 1970s, or Reagan and Gorbachev in the 1980s were preconditioned on the USA's recognizing the Soviet Union's right to exist as a communist state. We would still be fighting the Cold War. Well, guess what? The Russian people still exist, but the Soviet Union does not. Why does Israel's right to exist as a state for Jews only go unquestioned by the rest of the world? Dr. Bill. I have stayed at the Eldira Hotel before. It has a different flavor this time. It has become the collective compound for the Free Gaza movement here in Gaza. We filled a hotel beyond capacity. Outside, the main road is barricaded and off limits to the general public. We are protected by police officers and security men who monitor those walking in and out of the hotel. They do all this for our safety. They are trying to make sure that we are not infiltrated by Israeli collaborators or disgruntled locals who might be alienated by the West's affiliation with Israel. We are being treated extremely well by our hosts so far. It becomes clear very quickly that most of the people of Gaza are quite joyful that we are here. Still, we have to do our best to prevent an adverse security event like abduction, kidnapping, or killing. Here in Gaza, something like this could very well be one thing made to look like another. During the next few days we will wonder how much protection is enough and how much is stifling and too much. I want to walk down to the boats in the marina, where I have walked before by myself on previous trips. This time I need an escort of bodyguards to drive me there and back. I return to the Liberty and can't find the bags from Medicines du Monde, Cyprus, or the bag from Musher. I know exactly where I had put them. They must have been unloaded with the other bags, but they weren't at the hotel. They may have gone to the militia's health services. I hope that does not get me in trouble when I get home for providing material support, that is, medical supplies, to Hamas. After breakfast out on the veranda, we have a general meeting of FG to discuss our itinerary while here. Ismail Haniyeh, the Prime Minister in Gaza, would like to meet with us. It is our first morning after arrival in Gaza. Right now, Free Gaza movement needs to decide how our organization will respond to the demonization of Hamas and intimidation against meeting with their leaders by Israel, the USA, and EU. These Western powers, with external control over Gaza, have justified cruel collective punishment of the entire population because they consider Hamas a terrorist organization. After debating what to do amongst ourselves, I'm proud to say that Free Gaza movement refuses to buy into this kind of intimidation and demonization against simply talking with Hamas. We will not fall for this tactic to silence dialogue. We are here in Gaza to listen to the full spectrum of Palestinian opinion. We are willing to talk to any Palestinians who want to talk with us. At the same time, we resent how Israel meddles in internal American politics. We don't intend to meddle here. We are here to show that talking is preferable to endless war, the alternative to not talking. Consequently, it would be ludicrous for us not to meet with members of Hamas, the dominant political power right now in Gaza. This doesn't mean that individuals within our group cannot make their own decisions. Jeff Halper, the Israeli member of our delegation, decides not to meet with Hamas. He doesn't want the entire discourse among the media back in Israel to be dominated by the headline "Jeff Halper meets with Hamas." He wants the humanitarian hardships due directly to the siege in Gaza covered instead. Our first visit this morning is to Al-Shifa Hospital, the largest medical center in the Gaza Strip. It takes us up several city blocks, a luxury of space as far as Gaza is concerned. Al-Shifa is a large teaching hospital and has had the full spectrum of primary care and specialty services, which are starting to fall apart. But like other hospitals in Gaza, the problem is not lack of knowledge. Gaza physicians have been trained all over the world. Since the siege, further training abroad is drying up because it is becoming more difficult for medical students and residents from Gaza to come and go. In Gaza, the current problem is deterioration of the medical infrastructure due largely to the tightening siege. We are taken to the medical oncology unit, where they have fully trained oncologists, but now markedly limited stock of cancer chemotherapy drugs, which are rationed by Israel from outside. For example, when there are several patients with similar cancer diagnosis who need a particular course of chemotherapy, the doctors must choose between giving one patient a full course of treatment and denying it to others, or giving all patients incomplete courses of treatment limited by the on-again off-again interruption in supplies coming in through Israel. Over in the dialysis unit there are similar stories of deteriorating infrastructure. Patients who previously received dialysis 3 times per week are now limited to once per week. They are getting weaker because they have to wait longer for limited dialysis machines to purge the normal metabolic poisons from their bodies. This leads to further medical complications that could be mitigated through more frequent dialysis. Meanwhile, there are dialysis machines sitting up against the wall that are dormant because of a lack of reagents and repair parts to maintain them. In the surgical unit the breakdown of the system is similar. There are not enough anesthetic and surgical supplies to keep up with demand. Even though there are surgeons capable of doing the operations are not getting done because of the lack of essential supplies. The breakdown of medical services due to the siege increased the need for Gazans with certain medical problems to travel abroad. Efforts to travel abroad for medical services are being blocked by the Israelis. According to the Gaza Ministry of Health, as of August 2008, over 250 Palestinians had died while waiting through endless Israeli bureaucratic delays denying them exit to Egypt, Israel, Jordan, or other places for subspecialty care currently not available in Gaza. There are thousands of medical patients with time-sensitive illnesses whose lives are being directly threatened by the siege. There are also thousands of Gazan students whose hopes and future livelihoods are being destroyed by the siege. After visiting Al-Shifa Hospital, most of us take a bus north to a large assembly hall in the middle of Al-Shati Beach refugee camp. The hall is surrounded by cinder block apartments, with windows filled by the faces of local residents. They look down from their windows on us in the assembly hall and the proceedings begin. There are abundant still and movie cameras capturing our event with the Prime Minister